How do you explain so many Republicans in Washington now doing absolutely nothing when their constituents went to them and said, we're being kicked out because of illegal actions on the part of the government? Would you
Yep.
please help us? And there was no response. Or I've heard of one case of one Republican saying, just go get the shot. I mean,
Yep.
really?
Yep.
So how do you explain that?
Part of it's because of the psychological nature of what had been going on within the media. We remember that all the different news outlets and stations, this segment sponsored by Pfizer, sponsored by Moderna. You saw a lot of these advertisements that went out, realizing that some of these pharmaceutical companies, which profited immensely from these vaccines, were co-opting and making donations and even booking airtime and causing certain members of industry to profit. So I do give some grace for those that didn't see the issue or the constitutionality, because we have to remind ourselves this was a psychological warfare campaign weaponized against the people. And it should not be surprising that we have people who fell for it. In fact, that shouldn't be expected. It's validating to know, hey, I didn't fall for it. Good. That was one of the most aggressive campaigns that the modern world has ever seen. But still, we do need to give a little bit of grace to some who actually believed this is saving lives, who actually believed that by obtaining the shot, they were helping grandma or they were helping their neighbors down the road. So that's where I will say there needs to be a little bit of grace there. When it's unacceptable is when the powers of government were punishing people for not doing it. That's where I become exceedingly frustrated that individuals didn't see the red flags all over it. And you're right, we had a lot of Republicans who, frankly, were Republican in name only, and they very much advocated for much more of a authoritarian form of government that had nothing to do with the origins of the Republican Party and were completely in violation of the Republican creed. And I've long said I support Republicans who adhere to the creed itself, because the creed is clear on what the values should espouse. So I give a huge shout out today to Congressman Andy Biggs, because today on the House floor, and again, today being Thursday the 11th, on the House floor, Andy Biggs read and entered the Declaration of Military Accountability document and letter into the official congressional record. So today it occurred where that was entered into the congressional record. It's now a publicly searchable document where 231 individuals signed a joint letter indicating that in the event that the public or the government were not willing to hold aggressors within the Department of Defense accountable for their egregious oversteps, that we would. And that we would do so with peaceful means and not with force, but that we would pursue propping up and elevating candidates and elevating and supporting political individuals and those in the legislative realm so as to ensure that there was full accountability and transparency for these oversteps. So unfortunately, that came 2 years after these mandates were actually handed down, which in my opinion is 2 years too late. The original NDAA that was signed by Congress in 2022 did for a period of time rescind the order, but only so far. It didn't actually declare that the order itself was unconstitutional. That's one of the unique things that the legislative branch can do in their actions, is they can define the parameters of a bill and specific language. And they didn't really do that. In fact, they even merited that, well, this is a constitutional order, but we are requesting that it be rescinded. So now you've got all this restitution that you've just denied service members who were prosecuted. So I'm hoping the tides will change. I'm hoping that more advocates for freedom and equality in government will rise to the occasion and will finally start to advocate for these sound principles.
So you signed this recent Declaration of Military Accountability. We had Robert Greene Jr. on a couple weeks ago talking about this, who he authored the document. It was a vow to hold military leaders accountable via court martial, via holding their retirements back from them. How will this be accomplished? Like, how will you accomplish this? in Congress.
So the Uniform Code of Military Justice does have very specific stipulations where you can still hold people accountable for the actions that they undertook while they were serving in uniform, even if they've subsequently retired. So the letter itself requested three things. Number one, that the Department of Defense fully acknowledge the unconstitutionality of the order. Number two, that individuals who were punished would be made whole and that full restitution would be granted, to include back pay, to include restitution with rank lost or with opportunities lost, you name it, for individuals who were punished. And then number three, to ensure that the specific aggressors who instituted these orders, as well as every subordinate officer who enforced them, is personally held accountable under the articles of the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. That's really, in summary, what the letter is requesting. How we do that as Congress is, as a legislator, I'm, again, applying for a job, if you will, for the voters of Virginia 7. Legislators have the unique opportunity of writing language specifically within the bill. For example, when DHS used its 872 reorganization authorities, we saw to reform the department, and when we saw also the Affordable Care Act, there was specific language about portability of licensure. Portability of licensure had to be defined by a healthcare provider. Well, our legislative branch defines 16 different definitions of what a healthcare provider constituted. Very specific. So that when you use a language or you have a sentence, I shall authorize individual X to do X, Y, and Z, and this is the capacity I want them to do it. The supplementary documentation in that bill states specifically, this word means this. And there's sentences, there's articles, there's paragraphs. That's the uniqueness of some of the length of many of these bills. That is a power solely vested in the legislature. The legislature has the authority to initiate certain programs and specifically call out language to be initiated by governmental programs that are funded by the taxpayer. So uniquely, our legislative branch, which is Congress and the Senate, do have the authority to write in the National Defense Authorization Act or in other acts that are passed the parameters in which an action is constitutional or unconstitutional and what the limitations of that are. So that's a unique thing that Congress could have done by declaring this is an unconstitutional order. Any and all programs perpetuating X, Y, and Z action will hereby be cease and desist. There will be no supplementary funding that is authorized for use. Congress sets very clear parameters and guardrails on the dollars spent by these federal departments and how they're used. That's a unique thing that Congress can do as well. They can either withhold funding and say, we will not grant you funding of these programs here, these 10, maybe there's 25 different programs that they're going to fund. 10 of them, you will not receive a single penny until this report is finished or until this analysis is completed, because we want to determine, is this really wise for the American taxpayer? We want to see your information first before we fully fund it. $10 million here, $5 million there, you name it. The vaccine mandate was a perfect case point where Congress could have instituted specific guardrails to make it undeniably clear that the Department of Defense had no authorization to initiate or to enforce a mandate. And in fact, that if it had been pursued, full restitution would be granted to those who were targeted. They failed to do it. And so that's what I'm hoping to change. One of the many characteristics of legislature is absolute advocacy for the constituents you represent. And the 7th has a huge cohort of service members, both active and retired, former and current federal government employees, you name it. Many were impacted by these mandates, both the DoD mandate as well as 14043 and 14042, pertaining towards contractors and federal government employees. So if the legislature is unwilling to write specifically language that puts guardrails on these types of actions, then we need a new legislature. We need new elected officials with higher moral character and who are willing to put the constituents they represent before their own interests.